All right, so our first update that we would like to share with you, and many of you might have seen this in the newsletter, is that there is a new story map available online on our website. Allie Scott, who is our Deputy Midwest Climate Resilience Liaison, she has put this together. It's called Breaking Bonds: Wildlife Range Shifts in a Changing World. And this story map explores wildlife range shifts for the clan animals of the Menominee Nation. It's really incredible, and we hope you'll check it out and share it with those who might be interested and might be inspired by it. Another update for folks, particularly in the Midwest region, there is the Midwest CASC, so the Climate Adaptation Science Center's Small Research Projects funding. It's funding for up to $15,000 for activities that have the potential to help inspire or promote collaboration. And so, with this funding, the teams need to be either led by or include tribal partners and address adaptation issues of direct concern to tribal governments and communities in the Midwest region. So, activities could look like initial project scoping and data generation. It could be listening sessions, it could be workshops, related travel, demonstration projects, or just preliminary relationship building activities. We have the QR code on here for you to check this out more. The proposed work must be relevant to one of our science priorities at the Midwest CASC, and those include heavy precipitation and drought, loss of winter, altered hydrological regimes, novel terrestrial landscapes, and barriers to and opportunities for adaptation. So this funding is reviewed on a rolling basis. Normally, you'll hear back on if you've been accepted or not, or if there are more questions in a very short time frame. And we highly encourage those in the Midwest region to check out this funding um, for building partnerships and collaborative work. In addition, we have a summer symposium with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. In case you aren't aware, this will be August 3rd to the 6th in Minneapolis. So if you would like to attend and learn more about what the symposium entails, we will share these links with you in the chat. And I think that's it for announcements. I will turn it over to Allie to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Allie Scott. I am our Deputy Tribal Resilience Liaison, or as I like to say affectionately, Sarah number two. And I have the great pleasure today of introducing our speaker. So we have the privilege of having Dr. Jennifer Kanine, who is the director of the Kowabdanawa Otake Department, or They Watch Over This Land, for the Bokhagan Band of Potawatomi Indians, and she's been in that role for more than 10 years. This department works on natural resource, environmental, and agricultural projects. Dr. Kanine is a certified wildlife biologist with the Wildlife Society. She has over 25 years of experience in natural resources, and she obtained her bachelor's in natural resources and her master's in conservation biology from Central Michigan University and her doctorate in forest resources from the University of Georgia. So we're very excited because today Dr. Kanine is presenting about the Bokhagan Band's Dowagiac River restoration, which is a really, really cool project. Sarah and I had the really exciting privilege of getting to visit earlier this year, and there's been some updates to this ongoing work that we're really excited to hear about. So, Jennifer, I will turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Sarah. Just to get right into it, I will start sharing my screen here, and we will get right into what we're going to be talking about today. So as mentioned, just let me know that this is good for you guys.
Your slides aren't sharing.
They give it a second, maybe. Okay, hang on. Try it again. Share. Now.
Yes.
All right, awesome. Sorry about that. So as mentioned, we've been working on this project for well over a decade before we actually began doing a little bit of digging in the ground. So I have an affectionate title of a tribal wetland project with a decade of progress. Took a lot of different people, a lot of different agencies, and I'll kind of give a broad overview of where we're located, the band itself, and then start to kind of delve into how did we get to actually putting shovels in the ground and doing the work on the ground. So the Pokagon Band is located in southwestern Michigan, and we have approximately 6,875 acres of land. We have a 10 county service area that, sorry, I lost my PowerPoint. We have a 10 county service area in southwestern Michigan, and that encompasses approximately 68 acres of lakes and 40 miles of streams and rivers. The area I want to focus on is the St. Joseph River watershed. So that's that larger green watershed that you see. And then the sub-watershed that we're actually working in is the Dowagiac River watershed. So the Dowagiac River watershed is in Berrien, Cass, and Van Buren counties. So it's an inter-county watershed, and that will come into play when we talk a little bit in the future about the permits that were necessary. Related to climate impacts in southwestern Michigan, we have seen some changes over time. And one of the biggest things that we've seen is that we're getting less precipitation as snow, and we are getting more precipitation as rain. So a lot of that has to do with the Great Lakes not freezing. We're getting potentially more snowbelt snow when it's cold enough, but otherwise it's coming in as rain. So for instance, I have a couple pictures here showing in 2018, we had a severe rain event and a severe flooding event from snow melt as well as rain combined, and the river actually crested at 17.33 feet. The previous record was in 1950 at 15.1 feet. So if you look at that picture there, you can see that the river actually overflowed its banks and it actually made it up onto the shoreline, and we had a lot of flooding in the buildings that were right next to that river. And you'll also see that this figure here showing that cresting of the river at the 17.33 feet, and that's a record. We haven't had anything that high since 2018, but again, that's something that we're seeing more torrential rains, more damaging winds, and more flooding potential occurring. And then on the flip side, we have summer droughts. And so we have longer periods in the summer with little to no rain. So we have both of those extremes that are occurring. And what we're trying to do with this project is try to incorporate a bit of resilience into the actual ecosystem itself. So if you're not aware, the word Dowagiac actually comes from the Potawatomi language, and it means a place to hunt, fish, and forage. So it is of cultural significance and historical significance to the Potawatomi. One of the things that we thought about with this project is that this is a 7 generations project. We're looking into the future. We're looking at the potential for restoring ecosystem functions, enhancing that water quality, and providing a lot of different habitat niches and optimal habitat for our friends that we have out in the environment. So what have we seen historically? Historically, the river was dredged and straightened. So the river lost half of its length during the 1920s when the dredging operation occurred. Now, the main aspect related to that dredging operation was to create an ability to farm the wetlands that were adjacent to the river. So the headwaters of the river are located up near Decatur, Michigan, and the dredging started at Decatur and then moved south almost all the way to Niles, Michigan, but not quite. And then in that process, the river lost half of its length And then those dredge spoil piles are actually put on either side of the river. When you put those on either side of the river, you're disconnecting the river from its floodplains because the river has to come up much higher in order to actually come out of its banks and come onto the surrounding lands. But for the farmers, it meant that the water got off the land quickly. It meant that the water got into the river quickly so that they had more opportunities to farm these lands that were very rich lands. So that was something that was done in a lot of the United States, but definitely we saw it here in southwestern Michigan with the Dowagiac River. Now, the other thing that kind of ties into this project is that about 7.5 miles down the river, the Pucker Street Dam was built. So this was actually the first dam was built in 1828, and then after that, it turned into later it turned into a hydroelectric dam. Now, when it came up for relicensing in the early 2000s, about 2010 as well, they decided that it was no longer functioning as they had intended it to function, and they began the process of trying to determine how to remove this dam. So that comes into play later when we discuss, one of the reasons why we're doing this and what kind of an impact it has for tribal folks. And why do we care about the Dowagiac River? Well, overall, the Dowagiac River does have good water quality. It is a cool or a cold water system, and it's got a great fish diversity. So there's 41 species that have been collected downstream of the Pucker Street Dam. 37 native species and 4 salmonid species. And then the mussel diversity below the dam, we have at least 5 species of special concern or higher, meaning that they could be threatened or endangered as well, that actually occur below the Pucker Street Dam. So related, how did we start to determine that we wanted to do this project? So the Dowagiac River Watershed Management Plan was created in the early 2000s. And one of the things that that watershed management plan said was the best thing that could be done for this river is to restore its historic meander bends and reconnect it to its floodplain. So in 2007, approximately 3 miles south of where tribal properties are located, the Southwest Michigan Planning Commission, they reconnected a small meander bend back to the river. So that was the first start of can the historic meander bends be restored. And then in 2011, the band decided that they wanted to see if there was the possibility of actually restoring meander bends on tribal properties. So one of the first things we had to do was determine if it was feasible. So in order to do that, we had to do a lot of surveys. We had to do a lot of assessment. And within that feasibility study, we did topographic surveys, cross sections, geomorphic assessments. We were the cool kids on the block that flew LiDAR. You can get much better LiDAR than what we actually flown in 2012. But it was high quality and it was great for its time. We did depth refusals, we did soil borings, and then all along we had adjacent landowner meetings. So for over a decade, we were having landowner meetings with those that are surrounding tribal properties. The other thing is that this project is a large project, and we knew that it was going to take multiple years of funding to continue the project. And then in order for us to get to where we could actually start the project, we had to do a number of additional assessments. So we had to complete threatened and endangered surveys, and that was plants, it was wildlife. We had to do the environmental assessment. We completed the wetland delineation. We consulted very extensively with BIA and with our THPO office on how to move forward with this project to ensure that we didn't have any issues as it relates to NHPA. We completed a hydraulic analysis. Actually, we completed 3 hydraulic analyses. The first one came back and it kind of indicated that we would have a potential negative impact on our neighbors in a 100-year storm event. So we asked them to go back to the drawing board and have no impact. The second reconfiguration of the river actually showed a tiny bit of an impact in a 100-year storm event. So we asked them one more time, the engineers that we're working with, please go back to the drawing board and look at a configuration that has no net impact on our neighbors in a 100-year storm event. We didn't want to be bad neighbors, so we didn't want to put extra water on people's property because we were remeandering the river. So one of the things that I didn't think would be necessary and was a little bit later in the project was I needed to get a drain agreement with the drain commissioner and the intercounty drain because the Dowagiac River is considered an intercounty drain. We had to meet with the drain commissioners. They had to look at the actual plan and determine that it was acceptable and that they would sign off on it. And so we got a quit claim deed to the old abandoned river, and they got the access to the newly recreated historic river with the 6 new bends. And then while we were working on the project, we had to get temporary river crossings because we wanted to have quicker access to be able to bring our spoil piles up onto the property and not have to truck it around long distances to get to where it needed to go. And we worked with Michigan Fisheries and we worked with My Eagle to ensure that those temporary river crossings did not negatively impact fish access. And then we had our soil erosion and sediment control permits with the county and the tribe. The one thing being with this project is that it's entirely surrounded by tribal properties. So that's one of the ways that we were able to say that this was a feasible property or feasible project. We didn't have to have a lot of give and take and back and forth with surrounding landowners on, I'm putting the river in your backyard. I'm taking away a certain, access to a certain property. There wasn't a lot of back and forth because this is all tribal properties. And then I was saving up money and decided that it would be necessary to actually split this project into 2 phases. And the reason I decided that was because I had enough money to do the first phase, but not enough money to do the second phase when we started. And I wanted to try to use it as a proof of concept and a pilot study so that it could help to bring people to actually do the funding for the second phase. And there's a lot of people that funded this project. Mostly this was through BIA, GLRI funding, but we also had a GLRI funding through EPA and NOAA. We had My Eagle in there. We had the Great Lakes Fisheries Trust, NRCS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There was a lot of people that provided funding for this project. And then between the 2 phases, we were looking at $4.3 million without those engineering costs. And we've been working with the engineers for, almost a decade. So one of the things that I want to iterate is that we use the natural channel design when we were actually doing this. So we looked at those historic meander bends and the configuration that the river was in at one point in time based on the LIDAR. And we used the actual natural channel design. We use crib walls, we use floodplain jacks, and we actually widened the river a little bit wider than what it was historically because that hydraulic analysis, the last one that we completed, indicated that we needed to do that because we were also lifting the riverbed back up by 3 feet because it was dug down by like 6 feet when the dredges went through. So as you can see, kind of in this example drawing, we have some pools in areas. We have a little bit of a gravel riffle starting out, and then we have our crib walls and floodplain jack showing as well. So we were able to actually start the project on March 12th, 2022. One of the things that we learned during the first phase of the project was during this 2022, we had a setback. We actually had multiple setbacks. The first setback would be that we had a lot of rain, and so we were set back by about 40 days because the actual equipment could not get down into the floodplains to do the work that needed to be done. And then, although it was March of 2022, we still had some supply chain issues. We could not get everything that we had originally thought we wanted for the project. So we did make some substitutions based on the engineer's approval, but we need to, if you're looking at this, you need to think like at least 6 months ahead on what you need so that you can secure what you need. So this is the first, throughout the whole project, we actually did aerial imagery with our drones every 2 weeks to ensure that we were capturing the progress in the project. So this is our first picture of that first restoration, and you can see 2 of the bends, the trees being cleared there. The other thing that we wanted to make sure that we did was get those trees cleared before that bat season opened. So we didn't want to injure any bats in the process, and so those trees were all removed before that bat window opened. So you can see by May 5th, we made some progress here, but again, we had that setback a little bit as it related to us having a lot of rain coming into the area. By June 10th, we have not quite online, but we do have that first meander bend showing up here. And then we have it connected to that river by July 20th. Our first meander bend is connected to the river. You can also see that there is a temporary river crossing there. So we had to make sure that we put up some signage for those that might be canoeing down the river or kayaking down the river, that there was a portage there as well. By September 9th, the river was substantially complete. The only thing left to do for the first phase was to do additional hydroseeding and then plant the trees in that fall period. And so this is what it looked like the first February after the project. And what you can see here is you can see some of those crib walls with those root wads sticking out into the river. And those are intended to help to create complexity within the system so that we can have macroinvertebrates and other little fishes, and the turtles can get on those, and it creates a small habitat for those little critters that are in the river. So I was thinking that I wasn't going to be able to start the second phase of the project for maybe 2 to 5 or more years. But while we were doing phase 1, I was able to write and secure enough grant monies to be able to actually start phase 2 on November 15th of 2022. So remember, phase 1 ended September 9th of 2022, substantially complete, and we started phase 2 November 15th of 2022. So this essentially put 3 bends into the river. So you can see in the background phase 1 with those 2 big bends, and then you can see the beginnings of them starting to work on the phase 2, and this was taken December 6th of 2022. And then February 17, 2023, you can see that they've kind of outlined those areas. And again, we were outside of those bat windows when we took those trees down to make sure that we weren't having any issues. One of the things that I'll note during this phase is that we had just the opposite. There was a drought during this phase, which meant that when they were able to work in the restoration area, they got down in there and they started working quickly. And so we had a couple of times where we wanted to make sure that we got that drone imagery at a quicker pace because we were missing a lot during those 2-week intervals. And here you can see that there is kind of in the center of the picture, a little bit to the bottom, you can see that temporary river crossing that we had a permit from My Eagle there. And so here, May, we have the last 2 bends online with the river, and the first bend is the only one that is not online by May 31st of 2023. And then by June 21st, all the different bends are online, and it was substantially complete by 7/11 of 2023. All that remained was for us to do that seeding and then again to plant in the fall. So here we have our first after event, August 15th, 2023. You can see this is a little bit of a high water time frame. Which was good because we needed the rain to get the seeding established and to get some of those trees rain as well because they had just gone through that drought phase. So I have here a little aerial video. It's about a minute in length, and we start at the beginning of phase 1 and we go through the entire project here. And so most of the phase 2 trees, shrubs, and live stakes were planted in October of 2023. The cool thing that most people have mentioned is our contractors, the subcontractors, were responsible for replacing any failed trees, any failed large spots of plants that did not establish for the first 3 years. And so for phase one, we actually just exited this, and now we are entirely responsible for those trees, and we are responsible for any invasive species removals and maintenance of the area in phase one. There's still 1 year left on our 3 year maintenance. Well, now it's about 6 months left with our 3 year maintenance for the contractors in phase two. So when we did the project, we're providing niche habitats for the migratory fish and needed spawning, feeding, and fry habitat. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, like I was talking about the Pucker Street Dam a little bit earlier, when the Pucker Street Dam fully came out in fall of 2021, that meant that the fish that were below the dam for the first time in a century could come above the dam. So that means that the salmonids that were being stopped at the dam, they could start exploring the rest of the Dowagiac watershed, which was pretty amazing. One of the things that I wanted to see come out of this entire project was, I wanted to see tribal citizens fishing on the banks of tribal property river, and not needing, not having to have any kind of a license except for a tribal license, and actually fishing for those fish that hadn't been in this section of the river for 100 years. So fish that hadn't been here for a century, seeing them for the first time. One of the things I'll point out also is that in 2023, as we were working on phase two, there were reports that we had attempted spawning at the end of phase one. So Google Earth actually picked up the entire project in their most recent image in 2025. So what you see here are the 6 bends that were installed with the phase one and phase two. The Google Earth imagery is the one at the bottom there. So now that both of those phases are complete, we had taken a 0.66 mile of dredged and straightened river that was disconnected from its floodplain, and we've restored it to a 1.29 mile, and we've actually restored this historic sinuosity of the river, because each river has a sinuosity value, and this river in this section, we've been able to restore that historic sinuosity here, and we've recreated that connection to the floodplains. So with this project, we've actually been able to restore functional hydrology to 53 acres of adjacent wetlands within the floodplains. So how does that relate to climate resilience implications? So we have been monitoring, as we need to with our NOAA grant, the actual water levels within the river with some of the wells that we have, and comparing them to the USGS wells that are downstream. Also with the My Eagle permit, we had to document 2 bank full events and one overbank event. And so you can see here that that red dashed line is a bank fill elevation. So when the water gets to that red dashed line, it means we're at bank full. And then if it goes above that line, it means that we are at that overbank event. So we've hit the bank full event at least 3 times since they were established. The both phases were complete, and we've gone over bank on 2 occasions. It doesn't show on here, but just after the end of this figure, we had another overbank event. So what does it look like? It looks like the river reconnects to the floodplains. You can see here that we have flowing water actually coming out of the river and behind the banks of the river and into our forested floodplains. What we're doing here is we're actually keeping more water on tribal properties. So this is a high water event. This is from April 15th, 2026. And you can see where the river is overflowed its banks, it's filling in those forested wetlands and making connections with the surrounding wetlands, but also protecting our neighbors, right? So we are keeping more water on the landscape than what would have been here historically. And we are also, like I said, restoring that functional hydrology, but protecting our neighbors from these high flooding events. And so this one, was one of the higher ones that we have had. Like I said, we have 2 of those overbank events, but you can clearly see where the river comes out of its banks and it's reconnecting and it's filling in. And the other thing that really happens here is when that water overflows its banks and it comes into those areas where we have our floodplain jacks, those floodplain jacks are intended to slow the water down so that when it leaves tribal properties, it's leaving the sediments and silts behind, and the water is actually cleaner when it leaves the site than when it came onto the site. So with that, what other things are we planning on doing here? As I had said, we have our Eagle permit that we have to monitor for 5 years following the completion of the project. So that goes until 2028. We need to make sure that we're keeping invasive species out. And, we've documented 2 bankful events, and we've actually documented 2 overbank events at this point in time. We're doing mussel surveys in the area, macroinvertebrate surveys, habitat surveys, water quality. We've had a lot of different opportunities to provide teaching and education within the site. So, one of the things that I'll mention is that before we did the project, there were some folks that had said the river has always been straight. The river has always had no curves. And you can say that because it's been like that for over 100 years. So there's no one alive now that would know that the river bended and curved and had that sinuosity. But we know based on the LIDAR and based on other natural rivers that rivers aren't normal, they're not naturally straight. And so those same folks that made some of those comments are some of the same people that came up to us after the fact and asked us when we were going to be remeandering the river in their backyard. The band has also purchased another property at the natural springs called Crystal Springs. So we're looking at hydrogeologic investigation there. We're also looking at the potential to restore more bends further downstream. So we have another area where we can potentially restore 2.5 more miles of historic meander bends on tribal property. This would require a bit more work with landowners, but this is a long-term project, and we are committed to wanting to do that. One of the other things that we've done recently is a Dowagiac River survey. And so that one is actually pretty cool. It's online now. What we did was we had 360-degree longitudinal surveys done of the entire length of the Dowagiac River. They were done with kayaks. They were the person that was taking all of the recordings did 360 video. They made note of erosion areas, trash areas, water withdrawals. They carried one of our multi-probes with them so that they could take temperature and nitrates and conductivity. And then they also took habitat measurements so that we could try to determine, where there might be good, better places for our fish and wildlife. So all of that is actually online now at Fish Views. It's like a Google Street View for rivers. You can click on the kayak and you can move along the entire river and see, what was the temperature, what was if you're interested in only looking at the places for trash, like if it's a Girl Scout group or a Boy Scout group and they want to go out and pick up trash, they can click on the tables and they can actually get those locations of where the highest concentrations of trash are. But it's been really great. It's also can be used by like fishermen if they want to go to the coldest and deepest areas in the river. They can look at this information and see that as well. So we're hoping we can do this again in another 5 to 10 years and see how the changes have occurred over time. But that's definitely one of the things that we have been focused on for the past couple of years is just getting as much baseline information from the Dowagiac River as possible. And this was one of the ways to do it was with this longitudinal survey. So what's more is to come is that we are currently looking from the Sink Road Bridge to our Crystal Springs property, working with our engineers and trying to determine how feasible is it for us to restore another 2.5 miles to the Dowagiac River. We've had great success here. One of the things that I'll mention is that the eagles, we've had, since it's a little bit more open and it's not enclosed over the river with the trees, we've had eagles move in and build a nest on tribal properties, and they've fledged chicks for the past 2 years in the area, which has also helped us to keep the geese population or the goose population down because we've actually planted wild rice in the river in this location. So the geese were mowing down our wild rice. But then when the eagles are now here, they're helping to keep those geese away from the wild rice plantings. And so we're having a little bit more success as it relates to planting the southern river rice or Zizania aquatica within the area here. So with that, I will take any questions that you have. One last thing that I'll point out is any of the trees that we planted within the area were sourced within 100 miles, and any of the natives that we planted within the area also we tried to source them within 100 miles if we were able to do so. And I'll take any questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This is
You're
really
welcome.
awesome work. It's just so great to see the progress with this project that's been happening over such a long time. It is really, really incredible to see this river look like a beautiful natural river. And the drone imagery that you have from this is just so beautiful, and the thoughtfulness for all the different other beings that are living in this place. So thank you so much for that. We do have time for questions, and so I want to ask if you have a question. Please do put it in the chat, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand and we can call on you and you can unmute. I'll start with this first question that came through from Henry, who's asking, did you have flow readings at comparable gauge heights before and after the project took place?
Yeah, we have been taking readings at the site for going on 11 years now. Or actually, let me take that back, going on 15 years now. So we do have gauge data from before and after.
That's awesome. And so you've been able to compare what those readings were from before and
Yeah,
after as well.
definitely. And I'll also mention that we've actually did some of the same things as it relates to like the bats. So when we did the threatened and endangered species surveys, we put out those acoustic meters to look at what species of bats we had there. And then obviously when those trees all were removed and there was a lot of construction going on, the bats kind of, didn't want anything to do with the area, but we've since put those acoustic meters back out, and all the bat species that we expect to be there are there, and there's more of them in the area than what was there prior to the restoration occurring.
That is really cool. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more too about the wild rice restoration work that's going on. You mentioned that the eagles are helping with the waterfowl. I know that that's a concern throughout our region. So
Right.
if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So when the river comes into this area, obviously in other areas, it's not really amenable for wild rice planting because of how flashy the system is, with it being dredged and disconnected from its floodplains. But in this area, it slows down and it's able to, just come through the area. And there are bars that are coming up, popping up naturally, and those bars are some of the areas that we actually planted that rice on. And so for the first year that we planted the rice, what we found was that the rice grew and it wanted to be there, but as soon as it got to a certain point, the geese mowed it down, and so it really was only about this tall and flowering. And so we started to think about and that was before the eagles were there, and we started to think about what might be some different ways that we could plant the rice to help with that problem. And it kind of popped into my mind because I was taking a group on a walk through a site visit through the area, and we got to it. We were looking at the trees, and all of a sudden, directly in front of me was like a 10-foot tall stalk of aquatica up on the riverbank. And the reason it was there was because the geese couldn't, they didn't walk up the riverbank and onto the riverbank and through the weeds to get there. And so we started planting the rice actually in amongst some of those root wads that we see within the crib walls. And so we've seen a lot more success because of the fact that it's a little bit more inaccessible to those geese. And then combined with the fact that the eagles are in the area, so they're providing a little bit of a deterrent for the geese to be there for long periods of time. We're having more success in that area.
That is really fascinating. Kind of as a follow-up question, Sarah was wondering what other wildlife changes or increases have you noticed over the course of this project?
We've actually seen the red foxes in that area quite a bit. So the floodplain jacks are kind of like layered and screwed together, and part of that floodplain jack goes down about 15 feet, but then the others are kind of on the top of the soil. And so it does make a really great place for a critter to get underneath of there and make a den and then raise a family. So we've seen a lot of the foxes running around down in there. And obviously we've seen the deer down in there. One of the biggest things that I'll mention is seeing the shorebirds. So when you're looking at the rest of the river, there really isn't much shore because of the fact that it's eroded and the banks are so high. But in this area, we've got some of those mud flats developing, and those shorebirds are actually coming to the site, and they're, sticking their little beaks down in there, and they're feeding along the edges of the river, which I think is really cool.
That is so awesome to hear. Kind of going back to this question about stream flow, we have a question from Henry. Did you see any reductions in velocity in your data for the area where the project took place?
So one of the things that I'll note is that the river in this section doesn't have a lot of slope, so we're not in the quote unquote fast rapid area that's a little bit further downstream. But as it does come into the area, it's coming in and immediately slowing down. And so that was one of our expectations, and one of the things that we had in our engineer design with that natural channel design is that it is going to come in and it is going to slow down. And again, that's when some of those sediments fall out of solution and start to create those point bars and start to create those areas for those critters. And I'll also mention that in this section of the river related to the point bars and the slowing of the river, this is a great section for the turtles to be able to get in and out too. So, if you're a turtle in this river, you might get in the river, but your only way out is to try to find a log to get up onto the bank. But in this section, the slopes on the banks are such that those turtles can climb out wherever they want. They can bask, they can, do whatever life processes they want to do. They can make nests, and it's a lot more wildlife friendly throughout the whole project area.
Awesome. Yeah. So on the topic of slowing down,
Yeah.
I want to pivot a little bit and just talk about how this project has been taking place over such a long period of
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
This project was started, I know, before you came on board with your team.
Right.
And I think that there's something very impressive about that because oftentimes staff turnover or funding turnover or changes in political administration can make it really challenging to carry a project through. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how this project has remained active and you've carried it forward despite many of these different changes,
Right.
despite working with many different funding sources. And maybe any perspective or insight or advice that could help others in our audience that might be dealing with similar challenges.
So I guess I will circle back around and kind of touch on the fact that the band was very important in helping to develop the watershed management plan. And so as the band worked to help develop that watershed management plan and those recommendations coming out of that, were key in us, seeing that the most dire need of the river was to restore the sinuosity to the river, reconnect it to its floodplains. And so we, the first opportunity that the band had, so I've been with the band for almost 12 years, but I came in and that feasibility analysis was just at the a cusp of being completed. And so at that point in time, it was determined to be feasible for things to move forward. And so then all of the other pieces needed to be put together in order to continue to move forward, because you can't just say it's feasible, let's put a shovel in the ground. So a lot of that is based on funding because we didn't have a lot of money to be able to do that, right? So, we got funding from endangered species to do the surveys, then we got little bits of funding along the way to help us. Along with the fact that we're able to do a lot of those things in-house because we have those that are on staff that can actually do it. The water quality specialist, Grant Poole, did the wetland delineation. And then my technicians and my natural resource manager, set the bird surveys up, the bird acoustic surveys, and the bat acoustic, meters up. So a lot of it was just persistence, I guess. There were several times that we went to council and provided progress on the project to ensure that are they still on board? They still want us to move forward because if we can stop it before we get too far along, and it's always been it's always been the discussion that, we should do this because it's the right thing to do. We should do this because it's going to mean that this is a lifelong and project, and that it's going to be beneficial to the next 7 generations, and then having that, coincide with that dam removal definitely has even put more of an impetus on restoring a natural ecosystem so that the fish want to be there and the fish want to come to the tributaries and they want to come up the river. And I will note that the fish have been found all the way up to the headwaters of Decatur now. And we, with our electrofishing that was done this last year, we actually found young of the year salmon in our creek that's right outside of our office here. So we know that those salmon are coming up, and they're actually reproducing in some of these tributaries that they haven't been in for 100 years. And so for the first time this year, Grant was mentioning earlier this year that some of those fish that are coming up the river, it's their first time back into the Dowagiac after they were actually born in the Dowagiac. So it's the very first cycle for them coming back into the same place and not being stopped by that dam. So really, I'm kind of a cool thing. But yeah, there's always been that, desire and that cultural and traditional, desire to continue to move forward with the restoration of the ecosystem here since it's feasible and we were able to do that.
What a good story to have of these fish that are being able to restart their population
Yeah,
cycles in
yeah.
this place. That is so cool. We have a question about a relatively new emerging challenge that has been in the news a lot. Um, and Madeline is asking about seeing Dowagiac coming up a lot in the news because of the data center that is going in your area, the noise pollution, there's a lawsuit. So she's wondering, are there any impacts to this area from that project, or maybe to the watershed management plan or anything else that you know of with that issue?
Yeah, so we actually didn't. It's a very small data center right this minute, and so we didn't even, because they're so secretive in nature, we didn't know that it was even a thing until this company decided they wanted to start expanding. And then that's when a lot of the surrounding neighbors, started saying, "This is already loud enough. It's already making enough noise here. Why do we want to allow for something larger to be here?" And then I guess the biggest thing that we're seeing, you probably saw the call. I mean, maybe you haven't, but there was a call from the mayor for transparency from this data center. There was a supporting call from our council to request more information on what is actually being proposed out here, because right now no one really knows what the proposition is for the data center, how large it's going to be, where it's getting the water from, where it's looking at, how much water are we looking at. And so we're still in the kind of the grips of what is going on right now. But the citizens of Dowagiac have decided that they've already had enough. And they have, like as noted, there's a lawsuit because, and you've probably seen it on the news, the people just, you're sitting at a neighboring house and you can hear that noise, just like that noise going and going and going. And if that noise is being heard by this little data center, what is that going to mean if that data center expands? So we're aware of the data center, we're trying to keep an eye on it, but the lack of transparency and the ability of them to provide any data to any of us is kind of appalling and a little bit disheartening for us to try to even make any kind of decisions on.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insight about that. I know that that's a challenge that a lot of communities are wanting to learn more about. So thanks for commenting on that. I wanted to open it up for a last call for any questions. And Jennifer, while people think about their final questions, I just wanted to ask if there were any last reflections or things that you wanted to share about the project, maybe things that you're especially excited about moving forward or that have been really rewarding so far.
I think just seeing the diversity of the people that are interested in the project, and the people from different locations that we've had the Goshen College folks, they're down in Indiana, for 4 different years. They've visited us now and seen the project and wanted to, and multiple caveats from that have grown And then, the Mennonites have come to visit because they have a tie to the Trail of Death in Indiana. And so they wanted to find out more about other things that the tribe has been working on. So there are definite groups that I wouldn't have thought would be interested in coming and taking a look at the river and seeing what we actually have done here that have reached out. And there's been a couple of different agencies that have actually come down and looked at the river and probed our brains on what kind of, what were the permits that you use? How did you do this? How did you do that? If you could do this again, would you do something different type of a thing? Forest Service folks from the UP that are looking to remeander a river, and then another river in Ohio that's looking to do some remeandering. So, if we can be a small little part to help create more restorations across even this Midwest region, I think that that would be awesome, because this is now a more functional system, a more functional stream or river, providing more habitat for, everybody. I will point out that uh, you can see it, or you could see it in the pictures. There was trees left on either side of the river because they were thinking about erosional aspects, but they thought they were going to have to cut them down. So we always have those remnant lines of trees reminding us of where that river once was. And so that's a very prominent educational tool for people when I take them out onto the site. I bring them to an area where the first bend crosses, and that's where the old river historic 100-year configuration was located. And I say, you're standing where the old river, the straightened river was. Look behind you and look in front of you, and this is where the river used to be. And then, pointing out this is where the river now is because it's meandering. There's people are just blown away by, even thinking about it and being on the ground, actually seeing it. It's one thing to see it, in aerial images and in pictures online, but when you're on the site and you actually see the immensity of the project, as well as the thought and the care that was taken to actually try to get everything right, so that we wouldn't have to redo anything, right? It's pretty amazing in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. This is a really amazing story. I think it fills me with a lot of hope and excitement. It
Yeah,
is so cool to see something like this implemented on the ground, and I hope that others can take inspiration from this. And I'm so glad to hear that others are reaching out. If anybody from our webinar today wants to follow up with you, just to ask for questions or information, would that be okay? And where can they reach you?
definitely. It's a long email, and I can put it into the chat because sometimes we miss it when I have to spell the whole thing out for everybody. So
That
um,
sounds good. Well, we'll put that email in the chat then. Jennifer, thank you so much for your presentation, for answering all these questions. It's so cool to hear about this work. We're so grateful that you could join us today. Thanks to everybody who tuned in today for our webinar series. We'll have our next quarterly webinar in September. So keep an eye out for an announcement around that. And otherwise, keep an eye out for your biweekly newsletter and for other updates from ICRN. So thank you all so much.
thank you.